So in the Nexus module, you learned how to install Nexus on a DigitalOcean droplet, right? When we set it up, we had to do all of these steps in order to install and run Nexus on a DigitalOcean virtual server, right? We had to install Java, then we had to download Nexus package, we had to untar it, we had to create a Nexus user on an operating system, we had to give it permission to the Nexus directories, we had to configure Nexus to run with Nexus user, and then we were able to start Nexus Repository Manager. Now, an easier way to install Nexus and to get started with it much faster is actually to install it as a Docker container. And that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to install Nexus Repository Manager as a Docker container on a DigitalOcean droplet. So let's go to DigitalOcean. We have one droplet already that runs Nexus. So we're going to create a new one. Let's create a fresh new droplet. Let's choose this plan right here and create droplet. This is going to be the same droplet, same type, also in this case, same resources. And once it's ready, we can connect to it using this IP address. And let's actually change the name of our droplet because right now they are called the same. So let's call it Docker Nexus. And now we can connect to this droplet. However, first we will need to configure the firewall so that the correct ports are open for Docker and Nexus. So in the firewall configuration, we're going to add our droplet, called it Docker Nexus. And now our droplet has firewall configured. And we can access it on port 22. And let's do that. So SSH, root address, and we are on the server. Now, again, we don't have anything installed yet. And for this deployment, we actually only need Docker to be installed on this server. We don't need Java because we're not running Java application directly on the server. We are going to run Docker image, Docker container. So we're going to need Docker runtime. So I'm just going to type Docker here. And then we're going to first update the package manager. And then we can actually install the latest version. And Docker is installed. We have commands available. Docker is running. So now we can just go ahead and find a Nexus official image that we're going to start on the server. So on Docker Hub, we can look for Nexus 3. And here you see this is the official one from Sonatype. And this is the image that we need. So let's take a quick look at documentation of this image. Here we see how to run, which ports are open, etc. And when we start Nexus, we need one thing to configure for Docker, and that is storage. So we want Nexus obviously to persist all of its data on the server itself, on the host. So because of that, we are going to need to configure volume for it. Because otherwise, if the container died and we had to create a new one, then all the Nexus data will be gone. But we want to persist it on the server, just like it was before. So we're going to run it with mounted volume. So first, we're going to create a Docker volume. Let's actually use those commands and copy them. So volume create Nexus data. So Docker will create volume for us with this name. And then we can execute Docker run command to start Nexus container. So this will run the container in the background in a detached mode. This will allocate the port. So it will run on 8081 on the server's port, because we know the application is running on this port already inside the container. Here we just give a container name, otherwise it will just be auto-generated by Docker. And this is where we configure a volume. We created a named volume here that has some automatically generated path somewhere on the file system that Docker is managing. And we are gonna mount that path by referencing it using this name inside the Docker container in /nexus data. And this is just an image name. So we're gonna run this. Docker will pull the image, and Nexus just started. We can actually see whether the port is open. Let's install the netstat for debugging. So netstat is installed. Let's execute it again. And here you see the port is open, so we can actually send request to this port. And this will then forward it to Docker container. Let's also do Docker PS. And here you see our container is running, the port is open. And now if I go back to Droplet, let's take the IP address and the port. We're gonna see Nexus repository UI. So we deployed Nexus as a Docker image on a server. This actually was much faster than deployment without Docker because we only needed to install Docker, runtime, and then we could start the image pretty easily. Now, another thing that we did in the first installation was we created an operating system user, a Linux user, to run Nexus because it is a bad practice to run services with a root user. So if we go into the Docker container and do Docker PS, take the ID, and let's actually enter its shell or bash. And here you see a $sign means that it is running as a non-root user. And the user that is running inside the container is Nexus. So the user creation and starting Nexus with a Nexus user was also done out of the box. Inside the image, we didn't have to configure any of those. And if you need to check this kind of information in the image itself, if it's not in the documentation, you can usually look in the tags and just open one of those tags. And here you have the image layers. This is a view of a Docker file of how the Docker image was created. And here you see all the information. And at the bottom, we have user Nexus. And this is also good practice to run Docker images or Docker containers with their own service user. So if you have a container that runs as a root inside, is not very preferable. So this setup was pretty easy. We have another Nexus running where installation and deployment was much faster than the first time using Docker. And as we mounted a volume into a Nexus container, the data should be persisted on a server, on the server locally. So even if we remove the container, the data will still be there, which is also what we need because we don't want to lose this data. And if you want to see the actual location of where this data is stored on your server's file system, you can do Docker volume -. This will give you the list of all the volumes that you have configured. And this is the name of the volume. This is a named volume, so we have given it a name. If it's an anonymous, it's going to have a long hash as a name. So Docker inspect name of the volume will give us some more information about the volume, including the actual physical path on the server where that volume is located. So if we look inside that path, we see all the data of Nexus stored right here. So in the first installation, we saw that Nexus application was stored in a separate folder that included Nexus executables or binaries to start the application and a separate folder for data. And this is basically a separate folder where the data, the Nexus data, configurations, etc. is mounted. So this is the Sonatype work volume mount, so to say. And you will need this location to do backups, as well as maybe look up a password or some other information here for debugging, etc., to have some information. Alternatively, you can also look inside a Docker container file system, because all of these files are mounted into Docker container, so this file should be there as well. We can check that very quickly. Let's do docker exec again. And let's do ls. But first, we need to change to the home directory, because that's where the Nexus data folder is located. And here, let's do ls again. We mounted the volume into this path right here, /Nexus data. So if I look inside Nexus data, inside the container, because we're inside, I see the replication of this data because they are connected. So you can check this information either in the container itself or on the server like this.